Happy hauntings, horror fans! Welcome to the first episode of Meaghan's Murder Movies. I'm your host Meaghan, and today we will be dissecting the all-time classic slasher film, Scream. This is my favorite movie of all time, so it had to be where I started with this podcast. Full disclosure, there will be spoilers throughout the podcast, so listen at your own risk. Let's get started with a little summary on the movie. So Sidney Prescott is coming up on the 1-year anniversary of her mother's murder. She was an eyewitness at her mother's murder trial, and Sidney believes that a man named Cotton Weary murdered her mother after they were having an affair, they being Sidney's mother and Cotton. Just before the year anniversary, teenagers at Sidney's high school in Woodsboro start getting murdered, in addition to receiving taunting phone calls. After Sidney is attacked in her home, all signs point to her being on the killer's hit list, and Sidney's boyfriend becomes the main suspect as he shows up only seconds after she was attacked. The town issues a curfew, and the high schoolers throw a party, as is teenage fashion. This party turns into the climax of the film when Ghostface shows up and starts picking people off one by one. Sidney prevails in true final girl fashion and survives on the anniversary of her mother's murder despite being Ghostface's main target. Alright, now that we've got a summary, let's get into a little cast breakdown. Let's start off with the first character that we meet, and that is Casey Becker, played by the lovely Drew Barrymore. Before Scream, Drew played in E.T. and Stephen King's Firestarter, just to name a few films. She was originally cast to play Sidney, but due to other commitments, she took on the role of Casey instead. Drew was one of the biggest names associated with this film at the time, so by killing her off in the first 10 minutes, it really showed the audience that no one was safe and anyone was a target. Next, we have our final girl / main girl, Sidney Prescott, played by the incredibly talented Neve Campbell. Neve had starred in Party of Five, which was a TV series, and The Craft with Skeet Ulrich, who is also in Scream. She was kind of hesitant at first to play this role because it was a little bit similar to the character that she played on The Craft, and she didn't want to kind of put herself in a little typecast situation. But the director, Wes Craven, actually personally asked her to audition because he liked the work that she did in The Craft. This would also be her first main lead role, and how do you turn that down? I know I wouldn't have. Next up, we have news reporter Gail Weathers, played by Courtney Cox. Courtney was also in Family Ties, and she played Monica in Friends. She was also in Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. She really was kind of hoping to play a quote-unquote bitch role to offset her Friends role. The studio originally said no, but she fought for it and won the role. And I couldn't imagine anybody else playing Gail Weathers, to be honest. And our final strong female role goes to Rose McGowan, who plays Tatum Riley. Rose was also in Encino Man and The Doomed Generation, and she would later go on to play in the show Charmed. The studio thought that she was the perfect fit, and the studio also really wanted a strong female cast and hoped to attract a good female audience to come see the film. And I think that they definitely got that with McGowan, Cox, and Campbell. The three of them are great, absolutely wonderful, super talented, and I think played their roles really, really well. Next, let's jump to Officer Dwight Riley, Tatum's brother, played by David Arquette. David had played in Road Racers. He would also go on to play in Never Been Kissed, with Drew Barrymore in the future. They really wanted him to audition for Billy, but he really liked the character of Dwight, aka Dewey. The studio kind of thought that he was a little bit too small. They were hoping Dewey would be, very masculine, kind of buff, hunky, I think is how they described the character in the audition sheet, but Wes Craven actually really liked his kind of softer, funnier performance, and he ultimately ended up winning the role. Following that, we will jump to Billy Loomis, who is played by Skeet Ulrich. Skeet had starred in The Craft with Neve Campbell. He's also now currently in the show Riverdale on the CW, which is very popular. They liked that he looked like a young Johnny Depp circa Nightmare on Elm Street. It was also a plus that he and Neve had worked together, so they already had some pretty good rapport, some on-screen chemistry, and it just kind of helped them feel a lot more comfortable on set and in some of the intense scenes that they shot together for Scream. Then one of my personal favorite characters, Stu Macher, played by Matthew Lillard. Huge Matthew Lillard fan. His portrayal of Stu is absolutely great. So many of my favorite lines from Scream are said by Stu, aka Matthew. Lillard had starred in Animal Room, Hackers. He also later plays Shaggy in Scooby-Doo, which also a great cast choice. love it. He was actually at the studio with his girlfriend while she was auditioning for a role in a different film. They were just in the same building, and the casting director, Elisa Beach, saw him and asked him to audition, and he knocked it out of the park, totally crushed it. They loved him, and yeah, he was cast as Stu Macher. Another great comedic character in Scream. Kind of funny to talk about comedic characters in something that's supposed to be, a scary movie or a horror film. But Jamie Kennedy did an amazing job playing Randy Meeks in Scream. 1996 was a big year for Kennedy. Did his role of Randy Meeks in Scream, and then he also starred in Romeo plus Juliet by Baz Luhrmann, which also amazing. He plays he's got a little bit of a smaller role in that, but absolutely crushes it. So, and then in terms of cast, last but not least, we have Ghostface, the name and face and iconic image that you think of when you think about Scream is just the white mask and the voice. The voice has become so popular throughout the horror fan base, genre, whatever you want to call it. And the voice of Ghostface belongs to Roger Jackson. The iconic voice behind the mask was only meant to be a placeholder, and then they were gonna edit it in post and make it scarier, but they actually really loved what Jackson brought to the set and brought to the character of Ghostface. They loved it, so they kept his voice. He only spoke with the actors via phone when he was actually on the phone with them in the movie. He never met them on set. They never knew what he looked like. He would, be standing off set in a tent talking to them on the phone, doing the iconic, spooky voice. So yeah, definitely adds to it, and his voice will forever be known in horror cinema history, that is for sure. So now let's talk about where the idea for Scream came from. So Scream was written by Kevin Williamson, and he started writing Scream after he saw a television program, kind of 2020 type show about the Gainesville Ripper, who killed a couple of college students in 1990. I guess it left Williamson with, really uncomfortable feelings. He had nightmares after watching the show, and just kind of was inspired to write his own kind of version inspired by that. And that is how Woodsboro and Sydney and Scream was born. Wes Craven came in and directed Scream. He's known for his films The Last House on the Left, which is absolutely amazing, one of my favorites. The Hills Have Eyes, Deadly Blessing, Swamp Thing, A Nightmare on Elm Street, also a huge classic, and Deadly Friend, The Serpent and the Rainbow, Shocker, The People Under the Stairs, and Vampire in Brooklyn were all kind of horror movies that he did before he ended up doing Scream. Craven actually got his start directing in the adult film industry. He knew that was what he wanted to do, and he was having kind of a hard time, getting his foot in the door, and so he used that avenue to kind of master his craft and, figure out the tricks and tools of the trade, and went on after, his little stint directing in the adult film industry, was able to go on and direct some of the greatest films, definitely, at least in my book. All of these are, kind of favorites of mine in my rotation that I watch all the time. Especially The Last House on the Left and Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream. I think those were some of the first horror movies that I watched growing up, and ones that I still watch pretty much on a regular basis today. Now let's get into some fun facts about the film. So the iconic Ghostface mask was actually found in a room while they were scouting locations for one of the houses. They had been going back and forth on what they wanted this mask to look like, and in the script it said that it should, look like it could be found in any costume shop. Not hard to find. Anyone could have one, which makes the killer even more applicable to be anyone that you know. And yeah, they found this mask and took a picture and sent it to the studio, and they were like, this is what we want. And they were like, okay, I guess. And yeah, so it was just kind of a happy accident that the mask was found. And now it is pretty much you can find it anywhere, especially around Halloween. The Ghostface mask is very, very iconic. Interesting though, they actually talked about making the robe that Ghostface wears instead of the black robe, kind of like, Grim Reaper-esque. They talked about making it a white robe, and then they realized that might look too much like a KKK outfit, and so they scrapped that idea, and they were like, we'll go for the Grim Reaper robe as opposed to the KKK garb. So I think that was definitely a good call, because could have definitely sunk the movie if those connotations were laid in place. The special effects artist in Scream used over 50 gallons of fake blood throughout filming. It's also interesting because in, kind of the end scene where Billy is talking on the phone to Sydney, after it's revealed that him and Stu are in fact the killers, plot twist, there's two, not just one. He, in the scene, is actually supposed to just kind of set the phone down, but as he goes to do that, it kind of slips right out of his hand and knocks Matthew Lillard, aka Stu Macher, in the back of the head, which then he improvised the famous line, "You hit me with the phone, Dick," which is, kind of perfect because it's such an iconic line in the film and seems like it would be so believable with kind of the power dynamic that Billy and Stu had. Stu wasn't really a main player. He was almost just a pawn for Billy. Billy was like, wouldn't this be fun? We should do this thing. And, Stu also has that really good line where he's like, I'm very sensitive. It's peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive. And yeah, so that's just really interesting that, kind of the fake blood that's used caused that little slip up, which, just kind of seems to fit so perfectly with what they were setting up with the film anyway. Also, kind of that climax movie, the huge party that they throw at Stu Macher's house when they're supposed to kind of, be home under curfew. That scene runs about 42 minutes long. It was shot over the course of 21 days from, sunset to the sunrise. After it wrapped, I guess the crew had t-shirts made that said, "I survived scene 118, which is what the scene's name was during shooting. The cast and crew jokingly called it the longest night in horror history. I can't even imagine. There's so much intense stuff happening in those 42 minutes that it doesn't, when you look back, it doesn't seem like it's actually 42 minutes long. I remember when I first saw that, I actually went and watched it and timed it, and I was like, God, it is about 42 minutes long, that whole party scene, about half the movie, and there's so much going on, and yeah, you kind of have to shoot it from, sundown to sunrise. Just, yeah, absolutely wild. Definitely would have screwed up your sleep schedule, but they pulled it off, and, one of the best. Then one of my other favorite parts about the whole just Scream franchise in general is about how, I guess, self-aware it is, and how, I guess, meta would be the term used now, it is that, the characters have watched other horror movies that we've watched, Nightmare on Elm Street, The Hills Have Eyes, Halloween, that's a big one that's talked about. They have a whole conversation at Stu's party about Jamie Lee Curtis and, her being the Scream Queen, and they're watching the Halloween movies that night. And so we'll kind of break down some of the references made to other horror movies within the film when we get into the, scene by scene breakdown, but definitely some of the best, because it seems like the characters are, people that you really know, people you could really talk to. The references they make are references that, people who have seen other horror movies understand. And so there's this kind of understanding between, the audience and the movie and the characters. It's almost like an inside joke that everybody's in on, which is just awesome. And so before we kind of get into the main scene breakdowns, I want to go over the rules, the classic rules that everyone must abide by in order to survive a horror movie. You cannot have sex. You can't drink or do drugs. And never say, "I'll be right back," because you won't be back. That's just not how it works. So now that we know the rules and everyone's on the same page, let's get into a scene breakdown. Okay, so let's get into this scene-by-scene breakdown. Let's start with the opening sequence, the iconic sequence. Starts off, Drew Barrymore's character gets a phone call. Hello? Ghostface goes, who is this? She says, who are you trying to reach? He says, what number is this? She says, what number are you trying to reach? He says he doesn't know. She says, I think you have the wrong number. Have a good night. Take care. Very nice. Very cordial. Thinks somebody has the wrong number. No big deal. Puts the phone down, walks away. Same person calls back again. And he goes, I think I have the wrong number. And she's like, well, why did you dial it again? He goes, to apologize. Well, you're forgiven. Have a good night. Ghostface tries to keep her on the line by saying he just wants to chat. She says there's 900 numbers for that. She hangs up, walks away. Goes into the kitchen, starts the popcorn, gets another phone call. He wants to know her name. She says not gonna happen. He hears the popcorn rustling and asks what she's doing. She says she's making popcorn. Ghostface makes the comment that, well, I only eat popcorn when I'm at the movies. She says, I'm getting ready to watch a video. And this kind of leads to the iconic, do you like scary movies? What's your favorite scary movie? And so she proceeds to tell him her favorite scary movie is Halloween. He says that he also likes scary movies, and she guesses that his favorite scary movie is A Nightmare on Elm Street. And this kind of does the, back and forth, them kind of talking about scary movies. She says that the first Nightmare on Elm Street was really good, but the rest sucked. And this is kind of a nod to Wes Craven. He directed the first Nightmare on Elm Street, and then he kind of sold off his rights to the franchise before they started making the sequels. And a lot of people will say that, they really liked the first one, but they're not a huge fan of the sequels. And so that's just kind of his little nod to I knew how to do it best, and go me kind of a thing, which I agree. Maybe a strong opinion, but the first and original is definitely my favorite. So this is when the conversation turns a little bit flirty. He asks, do you have a boyfriend? She says, why? Do you want to ask me out on a date? So she doesn't answer the question, but they just kind of have this little back and forth. She says that she doesn't have a boyfriend. Ghostface asks her name again. This leads to one of my favorite little scenes where she goes, well, why do you want to know my name? And he goes, well, I want to know who I'm looking at. And then it just pans in on Drew Barrymore's face. Just sheer panic of, oh my gosh, this innocent phone call that we were kind of having, harmless fun type of deal could actually be potentially very dangerous, because now this person says that they can see me. So then she kind of looks outside, flips on the patio light. Ghostface prompts her with what happened? That's not what I said. I said I wanted to know who I was talking to, not who I'm looking at. And she's like, that's a lie. I'm done. And as she's hanging up, you hear Ghostface say, don't hang up on me. She hangs up, walks back to the kitchen, goes to take the popcorn off of the stove. Phone rings again. She jumps, picks up the phone and says, listen, asshole. And Ghostface says, no, you listen, you little bitch. Hang up on me again and I'll gut you like a fish. And so then that really kind of sets the scene even more of, this isn't good. By this point, the popcorn is probably burning. Definitely looks a little bit bigger than the Jiffy Pop thing that it should look like. She's like, what are you getting at? And he's like, I just want to play a game. Let's just play a game. Always a game with these serial killers. I don't understand. So then Ghostface basically calls her Blondie, which confirms even more, that this person on the other end of the line can see her. And so, very, very valid. She gets freaked out, runs to the front of the house, locks the door, is looking out kind of the top window of the front door. And Ghostface is now just taunting her, basically. Can you see me? She says she's going to call the police. He's like, they're never going to make it in time. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Basically, good luck if that's what you try to do. And then she says, well, my boyfriend's going to be here soon. He's not going to be happy about this. And Ghostface is like, well, I thought you didn't have a boyfriend, because that's what she told him earlier. And she says, I lied. He's big. He plays football. He's going to beat the shit out of you. So you better get out of here. And she's panicking. She's crying. Very emotional. Drew Barrymore, amazing in this scene. Just so iconic. So Ghostface is still taunting Casey in this moment. She's telling him to leave, talking about her boyfriend, all that jazz. And he goes, his name wouldn't happen to be Steve, would it? And she goes, how do you know his name? And Ghostface instructs her to turn on the patio light. And this is when he explains that they're going to play a game. Real simple. Movie trivia. He's going to give her a warm-up question even. No big deal. Name the killer in Halloween. He goes, it's your favorite scary movie. You know this. Take a breath. We're good. Come on. She's insistent that she doesn't want to play, but, he's really not giving her any other option. So, she gets it right. Michael Myers. Yep, that's the killer in Halloween. Past the warm-up question. Now on to the real question. Next question Ghostface gives her is name the killer in Friday the 13th. Casey thinks for a second and then very confidently says Jason. And that is incorrect because in the first Friday the 13th, as I'm sure a lot of you who are listening will know, that Mrs. Voorhees, Jason's mother, was the original killer in the first Friday the 13th, and Jason doesn't show up until Friday the 13th, part 2. So that means that Steve is out. Steve has lost the game because Casey got the answer wrong, and so Steve doesn't make it to round 2. His insides are on the outside when Casey next flips on the patio light. Her next question that she's given is trying to figure out which door Ghostface is at. He says you've got 3 doors into your house. You got the main door, the side door, and the patio door. And so she starts to kind of be like in this little hallway area of her house, and a patio chair comes through kind of the like patio door area. So she makes her way to the kitchen, runs to the kitchen. The kitchen is full of smoke because the popcorn that she was making on the stove has now caught fire. She grabs a knife from the butcher block and proceeds to go out kind of, I guess, what would be the side door of her house. So she walks around. She sees, Ghostface enter the house, this cloaked figure, and she sneaks out the door with this knife in her hand. Knife in one hand, phone in the other. She tries to sneak around basically to the front of her house. She sees her parents' car coming up the side of the house, and she's like, oh my gosh, my parents are here. They've got the car. This could be home free. Like, this could be good. She pops up in kind of the window in the, I guess, dining room area, maybe is what it would be, and Ghostface is standing there. So that's when you first see, like, a full-on image of the iconic, look, the mask with the hood and all of that. And he comes through, busts the window. She whacks him in the face with the phone and starts running. He comes after her. You see kind of her parents' car pull in. They get out of the house. They're talking about plants or whatever. And as she's running around the side of the house to try and get to her parents, thinking, if I can just make it to my parents, I'm going to be home free. Like, they don't explicitly say that, but that's the thought that's going through her head. Like, my parents are going to know what to do. They're going to figure this out. As she's making her way up the side of the house, Ghostface catches up to her from behind, kind of hooks his arm like around her and stabs her in the chest. They tussle on the ground for a second. She's able to get away. She's weak. She's been stabbed. He choked her. She can't talk. She gets to basically the front porch, and she's on the side of the house. And so she can see her parents walking in the front door, but they don't catch her in their peripherals as they're walking through the doorway. And, like I said, she was strangled for a sec. So she, her windpipe is crushed. She can't talk. And it sucks because she's so close in that moment. You're like, she could have made it. Like, she was 3 seconds away from potentially being home free, literally. But sadly, that's not the case. Ghostface gets her. Her parents walk in. First thing they see is, their patio kind of doorway busted in. At this point, the fire alarm is going off because of the popcorn, and they are very confused because their daughter is supposed to be home. Clearly something bad happened. They don't know what's going on. The dad finds the boyfriend on the patio, and they try to call the police. But Casey still has the receiver. So when her parents pick up the phone to call the police, they can hear her heavy breathing / wheezing on the other end. They're like, she's here, like she's on the property. She's got the other device. This is when Ghostface, because they're trying to talk to her, this is when Ghostface realizes that she still has the phone and it's still, kind of connected. So he takes the phone, hangs up, basically. They hear the line go dead. And this is when Casey's dad turns to her mom and says, drive down to the Mackenzies. And this is a line actually from Halloween. We won't go into that when I do Halloween. You know, we'll do a little revisit at that line. But it's a line from Halloween. And so, you know, she says, no, not my daughter. She's coming to the realization that something really bad happened and she's not even seen the dead boyfriend on the patio. And so he says, go, like, just go, drive down, get out. And so she opens that front door, and then that's when you see Drew Barrymore as Casey Becker hanging from a tree, insides on the outside. The opening sequence ends with her mom falling to her knees on the front porch, just screaming. And then it cuts to black. Next scene opens on our main girl, Sydney Prescott, sitting at her computer doing some stuff, and she starts hearing something outside of her bedroom window. This is where we meet her boyfriend, Billy Loomis. He comes in, sneaks through a window, has this great line that just gets me every time. Should be a red flag for every person in a relationship. If your partner says, I was at home watching The Exorcist, and it got me thinking about you, I feel like that's probably not a good thing. That's a little, and I love horror movies, but if someone was like, I was watching The Exorcist, and it made me think about you, I'd be like, why? So Billy tells her, I was at home watching The Exorcist and I was thinking about you. And Sydney kind of has this look on her face like, well, why? Like, that's not what I would equate with me at all. He goes, oh, it was edited for TV. All the good stuff was cut out. So this is where you kind of learn a little bit about Sydney and Billy's relationship. They've been dating for over a year. Things started off really good. And then when her mom was, assaulted and then murdered, that kind of puts Sydney in a place where she doesn't trust people. She really isn't wanting to have sex. I feel like totally valid with all the stuff that happened. She thought that she watched Cotton Weary, the person who she thought killed her mom, leave their house that night. She, I think harbors a lot of guilt for thinking that, she potentially could have done something to prevent her mother's murder. That's not really talked about, but, kind of what I have picked up on through all of my time watching the movie. They have a, little makeout session, whatever, and, it really just kind of sets up the dynamic of their relationship and introduces us to the characters of Sydney Prescott and Billy Loomis. So then cut to, what is the next day at school, and, we kind of get a little glimpse of Gail Weathers doing the news. Don't really meet her a whole lot just yet. We meet Tatum, Sydney's best friend, and Tatum's actually the one who tells her about Casey Becker and Stephen Orth, who's, Casey's boyfriend, who, that they got murdered the night before, and the police don't know who did it. You come to find out later that she probably knows all of that information from her brother, who is Deputy Dewey, who we will meet, here in a couple of minutes in the film. And Sydney makes a comment that Casey used to sit next to her in English. And Tatum goes, well, not anymore. And that just kind of gives you a glimpse into Tatum's kind of cynical attitude, her very upfront personality. And then that's when you learn that they're going to interview the whole school because they have no idea who did this or why. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It seems very random. And, obviously very intense murders, not just like simple gunshot, like they were gutted. And so Sydney, it's her turn. She goes in and she talks to Sheriff Burke and Dewey, Tatum's brother, and the principal. And they kind of make comments about, that she's Maureen's daughter, and she's been through a lot in the last year. So then that kind of sets up a little bit more of, Sydney's backstory and how everyone in town pretty much knows her and her story in terms of kind of what happened to her mom. Is big news in her town. So then we cut to school lunch, and Sydney and Tatum, Billy's friend, and Tatum's boyfriend Stu and their friend Randy are all sitting at a fountain eating lunch. So this is kind of when we get to meet Stu's character and Randy's character. So they're talking about the interviews that they had with the police. The boys are talking about how the police asked them if they like to hunt, and Tatum's like, well, they didn't ask me if I liked to hunt. And they're basically like, because, they were gutted, that's not something that typically a woman would do. And Tatum's a little offended. She's kind of like, well, there's plenty of female murderers and serial killers and movies that, have female killers in them. Basic Instinct, prime example. Randy is kind of, you meet him in this moment as the horror movie buff, very into cinema, but also very into horror. He keeps quoting lines from horror movies and just kind of making a joke of everything. As is Stu. Billy's kind of not saying a whole lot. Randy insinuates that it could be Stu. He says no, like I was with Tatum all night. Tatum basically, corroborates his alibi. So Sydney gets tired of their nonsense and their jokes and just kind of making light of the fact that 2 people have been murdered. She gets up and leaves. Next big scene is she gets home. She's talking with Tatum on the phone, and she's going to go stay the night at Tatum's house because her dad's out of town. So they're just kind of talking about, Tatum's going to come pick her up later in the evening. Sydney watches some TV. There's a news story going on about her mom's murder. She turns it off. She falls asleep on the couch. And she wakes up to the phone ringing in her house. It's Tatum. Tatum's apologizing for being late. Practice ran late. She's getting in the car. She's going to stop at the video store, rent a movie. Just kind of no big deal. Sydney jokes around, okay, well, you're running late. It's after the time you said you'd come get me. And Tatum says, oh, don't worry about it. Casey and Steve didn't beat it until well after. I think it was 9 o'clock. And she's like, oh, great. That's really comforting. Her and Tatum hang up the phone, and Sydney goes to walk away, and the phone starts ringing again. She thinks that it's going to be Tatum again. And so she tells Tatum without saying anything else. She's like, Tatum, just get in the car. And that's when you hear Ghostface. Sydney automatically thinks that it's Randy just playing a joke on her. She says that, she likes the thing that he's doing with his voice. She thinks it's sexy. Again, there's this kind of like flirtiness going on over the phone. I don't think I would flirt with a random stranger who called me, but I guess if you think that, she thinks it's Randy because he asks again the favorite line, what's your favorite scary movie? Sydney says she doesn't watch it because it's, insulting. It's usually some girl getting attacked, and she chooses to run up the stairs instead of going out the front door, how the girl always makes the wrong decisions kind of deal. And then the killer just kind of plays with her a little bit, much like in the way that he did with Casey, kind of saying that he's outside, saying that he's watching her. So she ends up, coming downstairs and unlocking the front door and stepping out on the front porch, just kind of showing that she's not afraid of whoever this is on the phone, because she thought that it was Randy at first, but it turns out it's not. The killer's actually already in the house, so she walks back in. The killer comes out of the closet. They struggle, they run around. Sydney basically fights for her life. She runs into a room and kind of barricades the door, and she's on her computer trying to get a hold of 911 via like the website that they have. And then the house goes silent. Everything falls silent. And then seconds later, as she's kind of walking toward the door, who appears in her bedroom window like they did the night prior? Her boyfriend, Billy. She gives him a hug. She's like, oh my gosh, the killer's here. I almost just died. We have to leave, blah, 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 blah. And a cell phone falls from his pocket. So she thinks that it was him, that he's the one who attacked her. So she opens the door, runs downstairs, opens the front door to kind of run out the front door like she had said the girl should do in the horror movie, and runs right into the Ghostface mask. And Officer Dewey was holding it up kind of in the doorway, not really like thinking that it was right in the doorway, not realizing that if someone comes out, that's the first thing they're going to see. So Sydney screams, and then Dewey screams, and that's kind of where this scene comes to a close. There's, tons of police there. Tatum gets there and is like, oh my gosh, what the heck? Tells Dewey, yeah, Sid's staying with us tonight. Gail shows up and is trying to ask questions. They're basically like, go away, go to hell, nobody wants you here, you suck. And they are all carted off to the police station, Billy included. At the police station, they interrogate Billy a little bit. They're like, why were you at Sydney's house? Why do you have a phone? Why this? Why that? And he's got pretty decent answers for everything. He's like, pretty much everybody has a cell phone nowadays, which, in the 90s wasn't as true as it is today. So that, kind of a old media thing. There's also not very many video stores with streaming and all of that stuff like Blockbuster. There's one left in the state that I live in. I think that might actually be the only one left. And as we're recording this podcast, that could change in the future, sadly. But yeah, so they're interrogating him. He basically says, yeah, well, I've gone to see Sydney before in the middle of the night. His dad's there with him. They kind of have a little, back and forth where you can very briefly see that him and his dad don't have the best relationship, just in the way that they talk to each other. Much like we really don't see Casey and her parents interact, but you can kind of tell just with a little bit that's written that they get along well and they care for each other. You don't really feel that with Billy and Billy's dad. So they get ready to leave the police station, they being Tatum and Sydney, to go to Tatum's house to kind of get some rest and just try and recoup after the, near-death experience that Sydney has just gone through. And as they're leaving the police station, Gail Weathers approaches her and is asking her questions about what happened and all this stuff. And originally Sydney's kind of playing nice, and then they start talking about the book that Gail wrote about Cotton Weary and Sydney's murder trial. And in the book, Gail calls Sydney a liar and thinks that she doesn't know what she's talking about. So Sydney says that, she'll be sure to read the book, kind of in like a sarcastic tone. And Gail says, oh, don't worry, I'll send you a copy. And at that point, Sydney turns around and decks Gail right in the face, just below her eye, kind of like cheekbone area, and Gail just collapses. That's when Dewey's pulling the car up, and they get in and they leave and they get to Tatum's. So they're kind of just, resting at Tatum's place, having their little sleepover, and Tatum's mom comes in and lets Sydney know that she has a call on the phone. Sydney is hoping that it's her dad. Tatum's mom thinks that it's not her dad. She goes out to answer it, and it's a ghost face. So this kind of, lulls you into this idea, well, it can't be Billy, the boyfriend, because he's still sitting at the jail, kind of being interrogated, and they hold him overnight and fingerprint him and, all of that stuff because they suspect him of committing a crime and a possible murder. But Ghostface, basically says that, she got the wrong guy again, kind of insinuating that, Cotton didn't kill her mother, that, possibly this Ghostface character did. And so Sydney gets really worried. They go and they get Officer Dewey out of his room because, again, Dewey and Tatum are siblings. I feel like that's kind of overlooked a lot, especially later on, that they actually are related. And so that definitely fits into kind of a lot of what's going on. And I think why Dewey feels protective over Sydney, because, Tatum and Sydney are the same age, and you kind of suspect that they've grown up together a lot. And so, Dewey's probably been in Sydney's life and vice versa for quite a few years. And so he probably views her very much like he does Tatum, as kind of this protective older brother role. So anyway, they go and they get Dewey from his room. He comes out with his gun drawn, just kind of waving it around. You can just kind of see his, as Gail would put it, inexperience showing. He's in a white t-shirt and boxers, just kind of waving his gun around, what's going on? What's happening? And you're like, buddy, you don't even know the half of it. And so they walk away from the phone, and it's just sitting there, not on the receiver, just kind of sitting on the counter, I'm guessing is what it would be. And he picks it up and just very cautiously goes, hello. And there's nothing there. Ghostface is hung up. It's just completely silly and kind of pointless. And he's still got his gun up in the air, ready to go. But he's in boxers and white socks and a white t-shirt. So then anyway, next scene, we get to school the next day. Sydney goes up to Gail and originally is going to apologize for punching Gail in the face. You can see Gail putting makeup on, the little shiner basically that she's got going on from the punch. And so they start talking about, Cotton being innocent, and Gail starting to realize that maybe Sydney's thinking that Cotton could be innocent, and that this new killer in town, or this killer who's now killing the high schoolers, could potentially be the person who killed her mother. So they kind of have this little back and forth, and Sydney stands her ground. She goes, no, it was Cotton. I saw him leaving our house wearing his coat. And Gail goes, no, you saw someone leaving your house wearing his coat. That doesn't mean it was Cotton leaving your house wearing his coat. So then Sydney goes in and she's talking to Tatum by her lockers, and Stu is basically talking about, how crazy everything is. And Sydney's Tatum's you just got to push through, you're going to be fine. fine. It's going to be okay. And Sydney's starting to feel really guilty about what she did to Billy because she's like, well, it couldn't have been Billy because I got that phone call last night while he was in jail. So as they're talking by the lockers, this person who's dressed up as Ghostface, who's not actually Ghostface, just a kid being a jerk, runs through the hallway screaming, but not screaming like bloody murder, just like making loud noise, waving his hands in the air. He's dressed in the like Grim Reaper with the Ghostface mask, waving his arms around. And Stu starts laughing, and he thinks that it's really funny, and he's like, it's like Christmas. Tatum takes the lollipop that she's got in her mouth and starts smacking him in the face with it, and she's like, knock it out, like basically you're not helping, you're stupid. Sydney walks away because she just kind of needs a minute to compose herself. And so as she's walking to what we will later find out is she's walking to the bathroom, she runs into Billy as he's coming up the stairway, and she gets a little freaked out. I think just because they ran into each other, not necessarily because it's Billy. I think she just like got scared that she bumped into someone with everything going on. She's just jumpy. She's on edge. I mean, she was almost murdered. That's totally valid. And so her and Billy kind of have this little awkward interaction. And so Sydney discloses to him that she got a call from the killer last night. He says, well, it couldn't have been me because I was, still in jail. He shows, his fingers that are still all, kind of got the ink on them, whatever it is that they use for the fingerprint stuff. Where it's kind of like, you've not washed your hands since leaving. And then Billy kind of gets a little, another red flag, I guess you could say. He basically kind of tells Sydney that she just needs to get over everything. She needs to get over her mom being murdered. She needs to get over, being almost killed. She just needs to just move on, like just be positive. Don't think about it, kind of a deal. And he uses the comparison that, well, my mom left my dad and I've not seen her in a while. So it's really the same thing. And she's like, well, your mom's not dead. Like my mom, like I'll never get to see my mom again. You could still see your mom, but like that, like your parents got divorced. That's really not the same thing. And then she stomps away, which like totally valid. And so he's realizing that he probably definitely put his foot in his mouth, and she walks into the bathroom and is just trying to, kind of compose herself, take a breath, just take some space. These two girls walk in to the bathroom and they're basically just kind of talking crap about Sydney, about how she kind of needs to, process her mom's death, but she's not processing it in a healthy way, just passing a lot of judgment. And fun fact, the blonde girl in that scene who's in the cheerleader uniform was Skeet Ulrich's girlfriend at the time of filming. So she plays the like cheerleader who's doing her, I think, lip gloss or whatever it is in the mirror. And they're talking about how Sydney could be the killer because she just hasn't processed her mom's murder, and that's how she's going to process it. They talk about the show Ricky Lake, which was really popular during that time period, and then they go ahead and leave. And so Sydney is feeling just really crappy. She's had a really rough couple of days. She doesn't really feel like she has any support. She really kind of doesn't have any support. Her dad's gone on a business trip. Tatum and Dewey are trying, but it's tough. I can't imagine what you would say to somebody who's going through all of these things. And so she feels really alone. And in the bathroom, she also gets attacked by Ghostface. Like, you see kind of the shot of under the bathroom stall door, and then you see these boots get on the ground. And then she runs out of the bathroom and kind of ducks under Ghostface's arm, I guess you could say, and goes. That is kind of marking, then it marks the end of the school day. And that's when you find out there's going to be a curfew. Everyone needs to go home. And that's when Stu's like, we don't need a curfew. Let's just throw a party. My parents are out of town. Party at my house. And so Tatum is like, okay, yeah, like we'll bring snacks. Come on, Sydney. It'll be fun. It'll be just like kind of a relaxing, chill, fun night. So Sydney agrees. She's like, fine, whatever, as long as Billy's not going to be there. And they're like, yeah, no, of course, we want to invite Billy. And so Stu's very excited. Then we cut to the video store where Randy works. He's clearly working, stocking some shelves with some videos, and Stu walks up and knocks all the movies out of his hand. In classic Stu, prank fashion. And so they're chatting, and Stu, he wants to clarify that Randy's going to be at the party. He says, yeah, I'm getting off early because of the curfew. We've had a ton of, people renting horror movies, I think because of the murders going on. And that's when Randy realizes that Billy Loomis is at the video store standing in the horror section. And he's like, that's kind of in poor taste. Like, if you were the prime suspect in a murder, you probably shouldn't be standing in the horror section. And that's when Stu comes to Billy's defense and is like, well, he didn't do anything, like they let him go. And Randy's like, no, that's like, just because they let him go doesn't mean he didn't do anything. In any, like, if this was a horror movie, Billy would be a suspect. And Stu, they kind of have this back and forth, and Stu's like, why would he want to kill his girlfriend? And Randy's like, well, there's always some stupid fucked up reason to kill your girlfriend, like maybe Sydney wouldn't sleep with him. And that's when you kind of realize that Randy's got a crush on Sydney. That it kind of clarifies, because Stu goes, oh, why? Is she saving herself for you? And he goes, well, maybe. Do you think that now, do you think that Sydney would go out with me now that, her and Billy are kind of not doing well? And Stu goes, absolutely not. I don't think so. Laughs in Randy's face. It's kind of sad. And then Randy kind of has this whole, like, very loud rant while he's working about how the cops are stupid. They don't know what they're doing. If they just watched prom night, it would save them time. They need to be looking at Billy because clearly he's the person who did it. Stu tries to pin it on Sydney's dad because they can't find him. They can't get a hold of him. They're not sure where he is. And Randy's like, that's just a red herring. Like, that's not important. So they have this back and forth, and Randy's like, I'm convinced that it's Billy. Like, it's Billy. And then he turns around and Billy is right there. Kind of puts his hands on his shoulders, and it becomes a very intense scene. And so Billy is face to face with Randy, talking with him, and Stu comes up behind Randy and like kind of boxes him in, like puts his arms, like hooks his arms over Randy's shoulders, so he's not going anywhere. Billy then pins it back on Randy and is like, well, maybe your horror freaked mind lost its reality button and you're actually the killer. And Randy goes, no, that's totally fair. If this was a horror movie, I would be a prime suspect, but that's not what it is. And so then they start talking about motives, and Randy says motives are incidental because it's the millennium. You don't need them. It's just, you just do it because you think it's fun. And, Billy and Stu are fine with that answer, and Billy walks away, leaving Randy and Stu standing there. And Randy turns to Stu and is like, that man is clearly a murderer. Like, that whole situation of Billy being like very up close and personal in Randy's face, like if you watch the scene, they are very close, and Billy is in his face, just like very quietly talking to him, like very calculated, very manipulative, just very uncomfortable. And Randy's like, I mean, that guy clearly is a bad guy. And Stu just kind of brushes it off. Is like, whatever. Then the next scene is, just kind of prepping for the party. Tatum and Sydney go to the grocery store and are getting snacks and things like that. Sydney's talking about how she feels bad about how things with her and Billy are going. And Tatum's basically like, don't worry about it. He's terrible. Like, he's not a good boyfriend. You shouldn't feel bad. He shouldn't be pressuring you basically to have sex. He shouldn't be pressuring you to get over your mom's murder. Like, all of your feelings are valid. Really trying to be a good friend, really trying to be nice and helpful. And then as they're walking through the grocery store, they're getting ice cream out of one of the freezer closets, the freezer things where they keep ice cream. You've been to a grocery store, and you see Ghostface reflection when they close the door and they walk away. So he's kind of chilling, just like stalking Sydney basically. Deputy Dewey goes to the police station to chat with Sheriff Burke. And Sheriff Burke basically tells Dewey to kind of just stay close to Sydney, just kind of keep an eye on her, make sure she's okay, because I think they're a little bit worried that, she's going to be a target. She got away. They think the killer's possibly going to come back for her. And then the next scene that we get to is the party. The, very long 40-minute scene of this party. And so it's a really great shot of the outside of the house. Absolutely gorgeous house, which I think they're going to use again in the upcoming one that actually comes out the 14th of January 2022. So today, very exciting. I'm super pumped to see it. Anyway, so they're back at Stu's house. Beautiful 2-story, nice front porch. He's in this red robe. They're getting ready to watch a bunch of horror movies. They're drinking, whatever. Party's in full swing by the time Tatum and Sydney get there. So like I said, they're getting ready to put on some horror movies. Also, another important thing to mention is Principal Hembry, who's the principal of Woodsboro High, gets murdered at the school. So this happens, after the school day ends. He's kind of scolding and talking to the two people who had dressed up in the ghost face mask and were running through the school, just kind of causing a ruckus. He's like, this is gross. 2 of your classmates have died. Another one's been attacked. Like, this is not funny. This is not a game. He's going to suspend them. They argue. He says, whatever, just get out. I don't want to deal with this right now. And then he puts on the ghost face mask and is like, making noises and stuff in his mirror, just kind of being weird. Someone knocks on his door, and so he goes, and there's no one in the hallway. He goes back, someone knocks on his door again, so he walks out kind of from his principal's office into, I guess, like the main office lobby or whatever you would call it of the school, and then he goes out into like the main hallway of the school, and he sees the janitor, Fred, who's actually dressed as Freddy Krueger with like the red and green striped sweater and the fedora, and he's Principal Hembry, is trying to figure out who's knocking on his door, and he goes back, and then that's when he gets back into his office. That's when he's killed by Ghostface. And so this death will come up later in the movie because Billy and Stu use Principal Hembry's death to distract all of the other party people to kind of go and see his body, because supposedly it's at the school on the football field. So this gets, kind of all the rest of the kids away from the party so that Billy and Stu can get Sydney, which is their main goal. So back to the party. So also at this party is Gail Weathers and her cameraman Kenny, because they think, where best to get some breaking news than at a teenage party post curfew. And Deputy Dewey is also there, just kind of hanging out, keeping an eye on things. Not going to bust anybody, but just, trying to make sure that everyone's safe. Keeping an eye on Sydney, basically. So the party's in full swing. This is when Randy has his great talk about the rules of horror movies, which we talked about earlier in the podcast about, don't have sex, don't drink or do drugs, and don't say I'll be right back. And then Stu says that he's going to go in the kitchen and get another beer. He says, I'll be right back. And Randy says, I'll see you in the kitchen with a knife, which is kind of a foreshadow into later on in the film. So they're watching horror movies and, Randy's, drunk, but talking about all of his movie trivia. Randy and I would get along so well. He's one of my absolute favorite characters. Just 10 out of 10. And Tatum goes out to get more beer at one point. Stu specifically asks her to go into the garage, into the beer fridge, and get her more beer. And everyone's like, oh yeah, me too. Oh, can you grab me one? And she's like, okay, I guess. So she heads out into the garage, and this is sadly Tatum's death scene. So she goes out, she grabs some beer, she turns around, and Ghostface is there, standing in the garage door, kind of stepping into the garage, closing the door into the house behind him. Not the garage door, but the door into the house. And so she thinks it's Randy automatically. She's like, you got to get rid of that. Sydney will freak if she sees it. And so then she, of course thinks that it's one of her friends. And so she starts joking around. She's like, oh, are we playing psycho killer? And Ghostface just nods his head. And she goes, oh, can I be the helpless victim? And Ghostface nods his head again. And then Ghostface grabs Tatum. And so she's got the beer and a couple of them fall out of her hand. And she's like, knock it off. Like, I don't like that. And one of my favorite lines that she has is, cut, Casper, that's a wrap. Because it's just so Tatum. It's just so her character, the cynical. She doesn't, I think she realizes that she's in trouble, but she's still trying to make a joke of things, which I kind of think is what would happen to me if I was in a situation like that. I definitely would tell the killer to fuck off, and I just, they would probably end up getting me killed. So, love Tatum for that line. And so her and the killer go back and forth. She tries to get away. She throws some beer bottles at him. And then she tries to, open the garage door so that she can get out from under, the big door that raises that you would pull the car in through. And as she's going, Ghostface shuts the garage door, so it starts closing again. And so then she decides next best idea is to go through the dog door that's in the garage door. So she tries to crawl out, and at that point Ghostface then raises the garage door. And so this scene, is definitely interesting in terms of like horror movie deaths because it's not something that you see often, but it definitely just isn't logical and is kind of a mistake because you can tell that Tatum would actually fit through the dog door that they had there, but she struggles and acts like she can't fit through it, so she gets stuck in it basically. And so then the garage door raises, and so it cuts, basically cuts into her and she dies, but there's like not enough blood, so I'm not really sure what the whole point was supposed to be, if it like broke her neck or if it suffocated her, because later it looks like she's kind of hanging more from like her neck and her shoulder, so I'm just a little confused as to like what exactly her cause of death specifically was, because I've seen a couple different theories about, oh no, it was she was suffocated, or oh no, you see sparks so she was electrocuted, or no, it like broke her neck and killed her fairly quickly, because there's not really a whole lot of blood. And so then Ghostface leaves and Tatum is left hanging with the garage door up, just legs kind of dangling, which we will see later when Sydney sadly comes upon her best friend's lifeless body. So at this point, the curfew has, hit that time of the evening. A lot of people are kind of heading home for the night. Sydney and Tatum, I think, are originally supposed to leave, and Sydney can't find Tatum. And at that point, Billy shows up. And it's totally planned. Like, Stu knew that Billy was going to be there. He's, very not subtle about the fact, like, oh, how about you guys go up into my parents' room and you guys can talk, or whatever, kind of insinuating that they're gonna have sex. Billy specifically tells him to look up subtlety, and Sydney says, yeah, no, it's probably a good idea, we probably should go talk. So the two of them go upstairs. Randy gets super bummed. Randy decides to stay and watch some more horror movies. So Sydney and Billy go upstairs. They have sex, which breaks the rule. Not good. After that, so while Billy and Sydney are upstairs, a bunch of the other high schoolers who decided not to go home at curfew and we're just gonna stay and hang out, they're watching Halloween, and Gail, Weathers, and Dewey are on a little walk. They've kind of been hanging out throughout the evening outside the house. They go in the house at one point. Gail plants a camera next to the TV, in hopes to just catch some footage, catch some stuff so that, she can get her story, basically. That's how she plans to break the story, is planting a camera. So Kenny, her cameraman, sitting in the van outside, kind of watching what's going on, kind of bored because it's just a bunch of teenagers drinking beer and talking about horror movies and being dumb. So at this point, while Billy and Sydney are upstairs having sex, Randy picks up the phone at Stu's house because it rings, and this is when you find out that Principal Hembry's dead and he's at the football field. And so pretty much everyone in the living room scene that's watching Halloween leaves to go see Principal Hembry's dead body, except for Randy. He's like, I'm not going anywhere. Like, I'm gonna watch Jamie Lee Curtis, as is classic Randy fashion and his obsession with Jamie Lee Curtis, which totally fair. I mean, the Halloween movies are great. So they all leave. He settles into the couch by himself, and like I said, Sydney and Billy are having sex upstairs. Gail and Dewey are kind of off-site, still in the area, but Dewey got a call about a car in the bushes a little ways away, so they go take a walk to kind of check out whose car this is. It ends up being Sydney's dad's car, Neil Prescott's car. As I said earlier, they haven't been able to get a hold of him. They're, not sure where he is. He's supposed to be at this conference, but he's not there actually, so no one really knows exactly where Sydney's dad is. But they found his car, finally. And then at this point is also when Dewey and Gail kiss. They've kind of had a whole flirty thing going on, throughout the film. Not super important. It'll come up in some of the later movies. They're, kind of on and again, off again relationship. But on this set, actually, David Arquette and Courtney Cox, the actors who play Gail and Dewey, met and fell in love, and they actually got married and were married for quite a few years. They're divorced now, but I think, their relationship's still pretty amicable. I mean, they're both going to be in the upcoming Scream movie, so they can't really hate each other that much, I guess. But yeah, so they actually ended up starting a relationship and getting married after starring in this movie together, so that's also kind of interesting. So then cut to Billy and Sydney being done with their little sexcapade, and they're both both getting dressed. They're kind of chit-chatting, and Billy, they're kind of having a conversation about the killer, and Sydney makes the comment, oh, it would have been really smart for you to call me while you were in jail or have someone else call me because, it totally would have, been really smart and thrown me off the trail. And he's like, what do I have to do to prove to you that I'm not a murderer? And at that point, Ghostface comes in behind him, and instead of being like, turn around, run, literally anything, Sydney just goes, Billy, and points. And then Billy turns around and gets slashed by Ghostface, turns around very dramatically, quote unquote, dies in front of Sydney. She starts running from Ghostface. They kind of fight it off in Stu's house a little bit. She runs up into what looks like an attic or a spare room upstairs, climbs out a window, jumps out the window, and falls on this like covered boat that was on a trailer right out in front of the garage. She rolls off of that, and that's when she sees that Tatum is dead. She starts to make her way up to the front of the house to, try and get help, try and find some kind of help, get away, whatever it is, all of the thoughts going through her head. And at that point, Ghostface goes downstairs and is behind Randy, like kind of behind the couch. And so Randy's all curled up with the pillow, just kind of hanging out. And this scene is so great because he's watching, Halloween, and it's a part where Michael Myers is behind Jamie Lee Curtis. And so he's like, turn around, Jamie, just turn around. It's gonna be fine. Just turn around. And the whole time Ghostface is standing behind Randy. And so it's very much like a mirror image of you're like, Randy, just turn around. Like, no. So you think at that point that Randy's gonna be murdered. Then it cuts back to Sydney. She's running to the front of the house. She sees Gale Weathers like news van that she's got, goes and pounds on that, and Kenny opens the door, and she's like, someone, like, the killer's here, blah 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 blah. And Kenny tries to help. He really does. He looks at he's like, we've got a camera in the house, it's fine. And as they look to the camera, they see Ghostface behind Randy, and Kenny starts doing exactly what Randy was doing to Jamie. He's like, turn around, kid, just turn around, get out of there. And that's when Kenny kind of calls back to the idea that when Gale watched the camera into the house, there was a little bit of a delay, about a 30-second delay. And so when he kind of goes to turn around to, I think, go in the house to try and save Randy, Ghostface is already outside the house and slashes Kenny's throat. So then Kenny goes down. He falls to the ground, and he was just trying to help. Like, poor Kenny, man. He didn't deserve that. He was just trying to do his job. He was just trying to, R.I.P. to Kenny. So Sydney crawls out of the van. She runs up to the front of the house with Ghostface chasing her. So Sydney takes off through this, like, weird side field thing. I'm not really sure, like, exactly where this area is supposed to be in accordance to Stu's house. But she's running through there, and at that point, Dewey and Gale are coming back up to the house after finding Neil Prescott's car. And Dewey says you need to, you need to get out of here, you need to get help, all this stuff. So she goes and gets in the news van and tries to leave. She doesn't find Kenny, which she thinks is weird, but she's just gonna get out of there. Gale is a very much save myself kind of a gal, which totally valid. I mean, especially because Kenny's already dead. So as she goes to pull away, she like flips on the lights, and she realizes that the windshield looks kind of funky. So she turns on the windshield wipers, and it's just covered in blood, which is just such an unsettling thought that the windshield wipers are just pushing blood around. So she goes to drive away and leave, and that's when Kenny kind of slides down onto the windshield, and you realize that Gale now knows that Kenny's dead, even though she probably figured that when he wasn't with the van, because where would Kenny go in the middle of the night? Probably not many places. And so as she's driving away and trying to get Kenny off the windshield, she almost runs over Sydney. Sydney comes out of this shrubbery area and is trying to wave down Gale in hopes that they could get away together. This causes Gale to run off the road, crash the van, and knock herself unconscious. Sydney gets out of the way. She ends up going back up to the house where she sees Dewey come out the front door, and he's got this weird look on his face, and Sydney looks so relieved because she's like, oh my gosh, thank goodness, someone that I know, someone who's friendly. And that's when Dewey falls to the ground with a knife in his back, and Ghostface appears in the doorway behind him. So Dewey's been stabbed, Dewey's down. Sydney backtracks to Dewey's car, his police car, car. Gets in, tries to radio for help, radios for backup to 261 Turner Lane, which is Stu Macher's address in the movie. Then her and Ghostface kind of get into this cat and mouse game because she's locking the door, but because Ghostface stabbed Dewey, he took Dewey's keys, and so he's just using the key fob to unlock the door. And then he ducks down, so Sydney can't see where he is exactly, but she's got her eyes on all of the locks because every time she locks one, Ghostface will come around to a different one and unlock it to basically try to get inside. Just him playing cat and mouse because that's just, he just loves, I think, to kind of incite the fear in his victims, which is, I think, going to be a pattern, repeated throughout all of the sequels. As they're playing this cat and mouse, Ghostface sneaks in through like the trunk of the car and comes up behind Sydney and starts strangling her. They have a little scuffle. She's able to get out of the car and kind of run toward the house. And when she gets out, Ghostface kind of does his little disappearing act where he's just vanishes kind of into thin air. So Sydney goes up to check on Dewey. She grabs his gun, and at that point Randy is kind of limping up the front walkway, I guess you could say, of Stu's house, saying, "You gotta help me, I don't know what's going on, like someone stabbed me," all this stuff. And then Stu turns up right as Randy and Sydney are talking, and she's pointing the gun, and Stu's like, "I think it's Randy. I don't know what's happening. I just found Tatum. They killed Tatum." He refers to her as my Tatum, trying to, I think spark some sensitivity and some heavy feelings for Sydney because Tatum was her best friend. And Sydney's basically like, "I don't trust either of you two. Fuck you both." She goes in, she slams the front door, and she locks it. At this point, you hear kind of scuffling behind her, and she turns around, and Billy is like half walking, half limping, ends up rolling down the stairs because he's still, like supposedly hurt. Him and Sydney kind of talk. She's like, "I'm so glad you're okay." He gets up and opens the door and lets Randy in, and Randy's like, "I don't know what's happening. Stu's gone mad." And then Billy turns around after he gets the gun from Sydney because he's like, "Oh, give me the gun, like I'll take care of you," kind of that idea. So she hands it over. He lets Randy in, and Billy turns around and says, "We all go a little mad sometimes," and shoots Randy. And Sydney's left standing there like so confused because, Billy was playing all injured 2 seconds ago, and now he's just got this evil look on his face. And then he quotes, that quote is Anthony Perkins in Psycho. And that's when you realize, if you hadn't already, that Billy is in fact a bad guy. Lots of red flags with that. I remember the first time I watched this, I was like, like you kind of wanted it to be someone else, but at the same time, like I wasn't super shocked that it was Billy because there were things about him that I was like, I don't really like any of this. You're just a little too greasy for me, sir. And I don't trust it. I don't trust it at all. Then Billy also reveals that the so-called blood that he's covered in, his blood that he's covered in, is actually just corn syrup, which is what they use for pig's blood in Carrie. So she realizes that, oh wow, it actually is, Billy who's the killer. And so she goes to run into the kitchen area, and that's when she runs smack into Stu. And he's standing there just like very out of it, just kind of staring off in one direction, very kind of focused, very stiff, very uncomfortable. You'd think if you were, kind of running, she almost like collapses into him of like, "Help me," and he's just like giving nothing back. Just very unsettling. This whole scene is just full of unsettling behavior. So then at this point, Stu holds up the little voice recorder thing and says, "Surprise, Sydney," which ends up being the Ghostface voice that he uses. So you realize that, dang, it's not just one killer, there's two killers. They bring Sydney into the kitchen and they have this whole running dialogue. Long story short, Billy's dad was sleeping with Sydney's mom, and that's why his mom left their family. And so he blames Sydney and her mom mom, and that's why they killed her mom. Stu says that they watched a lot of horror movies, they took a lot of notes, it was really fun, he had a good time, he's just kind of in it for, the thrill of it, but Billy has, a personal agenda. He went after Maureen, and then they went after Casey because, as kind of stated in that scene by the fountain, Casey dumped Stu so that she could date Steve. So those two were just kind of a test run, collateral damage. Like, it's got to be somebody who has, like somewhat of a personal vendetta. And then, yeah, everyone else, Principal Himbry was just kind of a means to an ends of getting, the rest of the party goers distracted. And then at this point, they bring out Sydney's father. He's tied up in the closet. They basically are like, yep, we're going to frame it all on him. We're going to kill both of you. It's going to look like, he snapped because he couldn't handle the anniversary of his wife's death. He killed all these people. He killed you. He kills himself. Bada bing, bada boom. A crime. For the history books. The perfect crime, as you will. The whole time Sydney's like, you guys are fucking ridiculous. This is wild. This is stupid. There's no reason for all of this. And then they get to the part where they're going to take turns stabbing each other so that it looks like they were potential victims that survived. They're going to be heroes. They're going to be this. They're going to be that. They've, created this whole thing. And then they do a callback to the rules about how Sydney, gave it up to Billy. So now she's got to die because those are the rules. But the acting in this scene is so good because you've got Skeet Ulrich, who's just very fixated, like just looks very determined. And then Stu is just kind of all over the place. Like, he's really hyper, he's really intense, he's jumping around, he's flailing a gun around. And Billy is just fixed on Sydney. And like, you need to understand that this is your fault, yours and your mother's. And at one point he says, we did your mom a favor by killing her. Doubtful, not really a thing, nice try, no. And then you've got Sydney, who's just like slightly paralyzed, but also crying, but she doesn't really show. She tries really hard not to show fear, which is really cool. She's such a strong character. 10 out of 10 for the acting in this scene. I think I'll just sit and watch this scene just isolated by itself because it's so good, and I just love all three of them in it. They play off of each other so well, but they're also different at the same time in terms of, how they're playing their characters and what their characters' like attitudes and behaviors would be like. So after Billy and Stu have stabbed each other and they're ready to kind of put the end on all of this, on this horror movie, basically, Billy tells Stu to grab the gun. He goes to the little like side counter table thing that he set it on, and it's gone because Gail Weathers came to in the van, walked back up to the house, kind of heard what was going on, took the gun. And so she's going to shoot them, but she doesn't have the knowledge. It's kind of funny because, in the second one, she calls Dewey inexperienced, but she didn't have, she's not like she really had experience either because she didn't take the safety off of the gun, which, if you've never been around guns, that's not her fault. But she tries to shoot them and then can't because the safety's on. And so Billy just like kicks her in the torso and she kind of collapses on the front porch. That gives Sydney just enough time to get away from the two of them because Billy wasn't paying attention. So Stu turns around and he says, Houston, we have a problem. And that line was actually improvised, which I love that because it's just so perfect. And, the two of them are covered in blood at this point. Billy's covered in fake blood, but then they're both also covered in their own real blood because they just stabbed each other. The whole story that they're creating. So Sydney gets away. She takes her dad, gets them kind of out of the kitchen area, which is where this whole scene has been taking place. And she calls Stu's phone, their landline, basically. And she's talking to Stu with kind of the ghost face voice. And she's like, basically, why are you doing this? And he's like, I'm far too sensitive. It was peer pressure. That's what I'm going to tell them, because Sydney's like, well, Billy's got a motive. What's your reason? And he's like, oh, I'm just too sensitive. It's just going to be peer pressure. Billy's like, we got to find her. You got to get up, because Stu is kneeling on the ground, it looks like. Maybe he's sitting in a chair, but I think he's just kind of kneeling on the ground at this little bench table thing. And he's like, I can't. I think you cut me too deep. Like I'm in a lot of pain. And he starts bleeding from his mouth. And so Billy takes the phone from Stu and basically is just threatening Sydney, calling her all these names, telling her he's gonna kill her, blah blah blah, classic murderer stuff. And he goes to set the phone down. And like I said, kind of in the fun facts, he's supposed to just kind of toss it on the table, but it slips out of his hand wrong and it hits Matthew Lillard in the back of the head, which causes him to improvise the line, "You hit me with the phone, dick," which is so good and it's so well done, and it just fits their characters of Billy kind of being this overwhelming presence and Stu just kind of really being pulled along. It's not to say that should not be held responsible for his actions, because he totally, fully, 150% should. I mean, he murdered people, but just kind of in that role of being the subordinate partner is just kind of entertaining. You know, Stu's having a really rough time. He was stabbed too deep. I think Billy probably did that on purpose because Billy wanted to be the sole survivor. And, you know, that old saying of two can keep a secret if one of them is dead. Like, Billy can get away with this as long as he's the only one who knows that he actually got away with something. So Billy goes to look for Sydney. She pops out of the closet as she's dressed in the ghost face like garb, the cloak and the mask, and stabs Billy with like an umbrella, causes him to fall down. And then at that point, Stu gets kind of the second wind of, you know, the adrenaline's pumping, he's not in pain anymore, and he goes after Sydney, tackles her. They, you know, roll around on the floor, they're fighting, she's trying to get away. He says that, you know, "I always had a thing for you, Sid," and she says, "In your dreams," as she pushes the giant TV. You know, like nowadays we have flat screen TVs and a lot of times they're mounted on walls, but you know, this is one of those lovely old 90s TVs that just weighs, you know, probably 150 pounds, maybe a little bit less. I don't know, maybe they're not that heavy. The one that my grandma had was really heavy. I remember when she passed and we had to move that thing and it was like ridiculously heavy. Anyway, she just pushes it over on Stu. So you see him get like electrocuted and, you know, his body kind of spasms and then it goes, you know, stops, it goes quiet. So you suspect that Stu has passed. Sydney has, I think, gotten both of them. She goes to kind of walk away and Billy comes back, tries to stab her, tries to get her, you know, one final time. And that's when Gail comes back in with the gun after she was knocked unconscious. She remembers to take the safety off that time. And she shoots Billy. And she says, "I remember the safety that time, you dick." And so, you know, you're like, it's over. Randy gets up. You know, we've got Gail and we've got Randy and we've got Sydney. I think, you know, those are going to be our three survivors. And Randy, you know, talks about the famous trope in horror movies that, you know, the killer's going to come back for one last scare. And he does. Billy does this little blah, reaches his hand up and Sydney shoots him in the head. He's not coming back that time. She says, you know, the famous kind of line at the end, "Not in my movie," which is great. Cut to kind of the police getting there, the backup getting there, the sun is rising. Gail has a new news crew and she, you know, she's got blood on her face. She's covered in, you know, dirt and grit and just, you know, grossness. And she starts doing a news feed, basically a newscast of what she's been through. She has a firsthand eyewitness account, really going to be great for her ratings and her numbers and her popularity. And that, you know, just kind of shedding some light. She's going to tell the world what happened here at 261 Turner Lane. And, you know, you see that Dewey's alive, you know, he's hanging in there. He's going to be okay. It pans over kind of like, you know, Stu's house kind of sits on this hillside. So it pans over and you see the valley and the sun's coming up and you're like, okay, you know, it's going to be good. Like, the killers are dead. We did it. She survived. We love a final girl moment. Randy survived. He makes a comment at the end that he's never been so happy to be a virgin, which is also just a great callback to, you know, his set of rules that he lives by. And then at the very end, you know, they cut. You think it's, you know, a happy ending, quote unquote. And then there's this split second, like it's quiet, it's silent. And then there's a split second where the screen goes black and you see the ghost face mask for just a fraction of a second. So it's so fast. Like, literally, if you blink, you'll miss it. I think it took me a couple of times to watch the movie to see it, because typically once that was over, I was like, yeah, no, this is it. It wasn't until someone pointed it out to me that I was like, oh my gosh, seriously? But yeah, so that's there. And the ghost face thing, you know, just pops back in just kind of as a little last unsettling bit for the audience. And then it rolls into credits. And that's Scream. And it's one of my favorites, and I've seen it so many times, and talking about it today just makes me want to make popcorn and watch it again. You know, maybe one of these days if I get real bold enough, I'll do the platinum blonde bob with the bangs. I doubt it. I don't think that's gonna happen. You know, maybe for Halloween one year. Maybe I'll dress up as Casey Becker for Halloween one year. But absolutely love it. One of my favorite horror movie films of all time. Definitely a classic. Really kind of revamped the slasher films. You know, there was a period of time where horror movies were doing really good, and then they kind of just had the same ideas. You know, I think it was once they got to, Friday the 13th Part 6 and Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5 that people kind of stopped watching horror movies. It was, there wasn't anything original. There wasn't anything new until, Scream. And there, honestly, a pretty good twist, like having two killers, having two teenage high school killers, that the motive is one of them is, vengeance for his mom, I guess, or for himself, or, whatever Billy's twisted thing is about, well, your mom slept with my dad and that's why my mom left, so she had to die. It's like, debatable. And then Stu's just kind of along for the ride because he's not got nothing better to do. But yeah, thank you guys so much for listening and letting me talk your ear off about one of my favorite scary movies of all time. That's why I'm doing this, just so that I get a chance to talk about one of my favorite things. Yeah, super excited to kind of have this podcast kick off. And next week we will be dissecting The Conjuring, which probably, this is my favorite movie of all time, but I think The Conjuring is my favorite horror movie of all time. I've seen it, I don't even know how many times, and there are still scenes in it that give me chills to this day, which doesn't happen very often. So I think, yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite horror movies, and I'm super excited to get into that with you guys. But I hope you guys have a great weekend, week, whatever, whenever you're listening to this. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. If you guys enjoyed the show and want to give me a follow on social media, or give the pod a follow on social media, I guess, it is M as in Massacre Murder Movies. So M Murder Movies on Instagram and Twitter. If you want to give us a follow, go ahead, and I will see you in the next one. Stay spooky.